Okay, guys, if you missed Monday, day 9, here's what we did. Today was a big day. We did World War II. The warm-up question is here on the screen, and you can do that in your warm-up packet that looks like this right there. This will be in the crate. It's also going to be linked in Google Classroom. So we did the warm-up. We discussed it. If you want to catch up, that would be great. Then we did an intensive lecture of like the nuts and bolts of World War I. So basically, I'm going to post this slide deck. I'm not going to waste my own time showing these videos, but there's videos that are in the slide deck that I'd encourage you to watch. So the first one is the Depression. Basically, it gives us a background to what led up to World War II. So basically, following World War I, the 1920s were very prosperous. People were happy, healthy, making money. And then the economy crashed and people were poor and broke. So basically, there's this attitude in the early 1930s, from the late 20s into the early 30s, of scarcity. People are hungry. They're moving around to find work. It's pretty rough, pretty bad. That leads us into the start of World War II. And here's kind of a big picture view of the war. So on your notes, these are guided notes. So basically you fill in the blank. Wherever there's a blank, fill it in. Other times in your notes, I'll have just a blank space. When there's a blank space, I'm just looking for you to write down something that you think is important, like kind of the big picture, the main points. So we're looking at the biggest war in human history. These are the years. These are the two sides, the Axis and the Allied powers. And estimates vary, but we're looking at about 70 to 85 million people dead. The crazy thing to me, guys, this is 3% of the whole global population. So of countries involved, it was obviously more than 3%, but pretty wild. Another crazy thing to me is that there's more civilians that died than the military by quite a long stretch, twice as many civilian casualties compared to the military. All right, here's some causes. Most historians can narrow it down to a few things. We're going to use this acronym WAR, the World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. A for appeasement and R for the rise of totalitarianism. We're going to go into all these in a second right here. So the first one is how the First World War led to the Second World War. So the visual here is German kids playing with the German currency. It was so worthless, like it had lost its value to the point where kids are playing with bricks of money here, which is kind of crazy to me. As a part of the Treaty of Versailles, there's a few things. Germany lost a ton of land. They also had to pay these penalty or these war reparations, which was the equivalent of $57 trillion. And they're basically bankrupt, embarrassed, they're angry, and they're desperate for someone to bring them out of this depression. Just like we had a depression, so did they, particularly after paying all these big war reparations. So desperate people might turn to a desperate leader for a solution. The A in war is appeasement. So this is a picture of the the Prime Minister of Great Britain. His name's Chamberlain, shaking hands with Hitler. And basically what the strategy was leading up to World War II is just to keep the peace. So instead of standing up to someone, they would just like kind of let it go, or like enforce like a mild consequence, milder than it should have been. So basically, appeasement just showed Hitler that he could do whatever he want. And this quote right here, "Peace in our time," is something that this guy right here, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, said. He's trying to keep the peace, basically. He viewed this handshake agreement as like a success. In reality, this is what happened. So this is a cartoon from Dr. Seuss that kind of shows this person in the center is the appeaser, handing out lollipops to these Nazi monster-looking dragon things. And basically the idea is like if you just keep giving in and giving in and giving in, they're just going to keep wanting more and more and more. Here's another one, kind of making fun of like all these spineless leaders of democracy, laying down for Hitler. And these words right here are basically showing like ways that he like broke treaties, and then these question marks of like what's next. And then the last thing is the R is the rise of totalitarianism. So in your notes, basically, it's a system of government where the leader has near total control. in a totalitarian regime or government, your individual rights as a person are not nearly as important as the rights of the nation. So, for example, there is no right to vote. You may have limited or no free speech. We're turning on to the second page of your notes. The government controls the economy. So businesses might be owned by private people, but the government can kind of tell them what to do and what not to do. Oftentimes it's a police state. So there's this kind of militarized police force that can use terror against citizens. Oftentimes there's also censorship of the media, which means that the government can control what it is that you see and you don't see. So a simple example of censorship that we see in the United States is like when a curse word is bleeped or something like that. In really major examples, the government might have their own television network. They might ban rival news networks. They might show you only certain things on the internet. They might even ban things like social media. I just wanted to show you that totalitarianism is like the big umbrella term. A lot of times, totalitarian leader, which is just a strong leader, can also be all of these things, like a communist dictator or a fascist dictator, or even a military dictator where the leader of a country is actually the leader of the military. So we'll get in, the one we really need to know is fascism, and we're going to get into that right now. So your next header in your notes is what is fascism? It's right here. It's a political belief that says the individual is less important than the nation. Oftentimes they glorify violence, and they use violence as a way to show strength. They use nationalism and racism to achieve these goals, and oftentimes fascist leaders are dictators or totalitarian leaders. Italy starts as a fascist government under Benito Mussolini. We're going to see him in a minute. And then Germany also becomes fascist eventually. The symbol of fascism is actually this. I wanted to show this to the class. The idea here is that these little vertical things are sticks or twigs. And the idea is like a twig or a stick is weak on its own. But when they're bound together and lashed together, they can create this really powerful thing. So in areas where you don't have big trunks and big trees, this is what they would do to make tools. So this is basically like an axe. That's made up of not a big axe handle that's strong, but of these little twigs that are lashed together with some sort of a rope or twine. And this is the metaphor of fascism. Individually, alone, we're twigs. As individuals, we're weak. We're worthless. But together, if we bound together, we're strong. So I have a few images here of these big rallies that would kind of show the clout and the power. Oftentimes, they'd like demand citizens to attend, and there'd be these big kind of formal displays. Okay, the next part of your notes, total war. This is really important to understand. So World War II is what we call a total war, similar to World War I, where the government controls a lot of the citizenry and the economy during the war. So here's what it looks like. In the United States and in many other countries, there was rationing of food and materials. So the government would basically say how much of a certain thing citizens could have. So what this would look like is if you wanted to buy sugar or butter, you would need this like a government issued coupon. You would still need to buy the sugar or butter, but what it would mean is you could only buy like a very small amount. So like, I don't know if this is true, but just like imagine, instead of going to the store and buying like 4 sticks of butter, like no big deal. Like what if you were limited, like your household was limited to like a half a stick of butter a week? It really forced people to like limit their use of these items. And the purpose of this is so a lot of these things could be used in the war effort. So they extend to things, to materials, even like gasoline and rubber. Also, part of total war is a draft, enlisting soldiers to fight in the war, and also propaganda campaigns. The United States, we're going to see a lot of these posters. The United States had a lot of like government-run advertising campaigns to try to get people to think or believe a certain thing, to get behind the war effort, to reduce their consumption of sugar and butter, things like that. And then basically, to some extent, all citizens are engaged in the war effort. And this could look like a lot of things. It could be buying a war bond, which, to put it simply, is you give the government your money, some money, and then they pay it back to you in a certain amount of time. So like imagine you get your paycheck and you take $100 of that paycheck. You give it to the government in the form of like purchasing a war bond. And then the government's going to keep your money and use your money for the war. And then they're going to pay you back in a certain amount of time. Oftentimes it was about 5 years or sometimes even 10 years. They're going to pay you back all your money plus a little interest. So you might get your $100 plus like $5 in interest. So it was a way to kind of finance the war. Another thing that happened during World War II, and an example of total war, is that the government would basically convert factories to produce wartime products. So imagine like the government goes into a Ford plant that makes cars and trucks and says, hey, now you're going to stop making cars tomorrow. You're going to start making tanks. And the crazy thing that I thought from this was just that not a single car was produced during the war, which is kind of baffling. Here's a few examples of propaganda posters encouraging people to like reduce their consumption so this like friendly soldier can drink his coffee, maybe with some sugar. Or to plant a garden. The idea here is if you grow your own food in your backyard, you don't have to go to the store to buy food. And in theory, we're giving more food away to be used for the military. And then other things is just like reduce reuse. Like instead of buying a new pair of pants, patch them. So the idea is like the less you use as a citizen, the more that will be there for the military. Here's a quick definition of propaganda. You can sum this up in your own words, or you can copy that down. If I had to define propaganda in my own words, I would say it's like an advertisement, except to get you to, it's not to get you to buy something, it's to get you to think or believe something. So if I was defining this in my own words, it's like an advertisement to influence a person's belief. Here's a few more examples of what propaganda looked like. I think this one's really brilliant. This one's encouraging people to carpool and join these things they started called car sharing clubs, with the whole idea of saving gas. And they're making this connection that a simple action like driving your car alone might not seem like a big deal, but imagine like when you ride alone, you're wasting gas, you're like supporting Nazis and Hitler. Or another example of propaganda is like there was a big push to like keep secrets, to not be suspicious of people around you and not to talk carelessly about information that you might know about the war effort. So for example, imagine this woman's like husband wrote her a letter. She should be careful about who she talks to because her neighbor that she's like chatting with while she gets the mail might be a spy or might be a German national or something like that. Next on your notes, these are the major players. And here's a quick visual just to show you what they look like. You jot down the country they're from. I gave you the name in your notes. The next question is basically like, how did this all start and like, what did Hitler want? So basically, it's this kind of like snowball effect where it starts small and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So Hitler kind of made a series of decisions that led to war. Here's kind of like the preface or like the preview to the war. So the first thing he did is he built up the military, which is against the law. The Treaty of Versailles basically limited the size of the German military to be like really tiny and basically not a threat. He basically announced, hey, we're going to build up the military. Next thing he did was he went into this area called the demilitarized zone, where the military was not allowed to go. And he just went there a year later. Another thing that he did is he moved into the demilitarized zone and no one did much. So then he thought, well, let's like go other places. So he has this idea of Lebensraum, or like living space in German. And the idea is like, well, these people need, my chosen people, they need space to live. So he starts basically invading neighboring countries to give his culturally and linguistically German people space to live. So he goes over to neighboring Austria and annexes it, which is a kind of a way to say like it's controlled by Germany. He goes into this other territory in Czechoslovakia where there's German-speaking peoples and basically takes it over. Then he just continues and takes over the rest of the country. Finally, he just invades the next country. He's kind of gone unchecked so long that he just invades the next country. And when he invades Poland, that's kind of the straw that forces other countries into action. So here's a quick map showing this is this demilitarized zone. This is the area between Germany and France over here. So basically, it's this buffer area to kind of just like keep the military back so they're not a threat. This light brown area is the Sudetenland, and then the dark brown area is where the territories that he invades in Czechoslovakia. The war technically starts then when Germany invades Poland. That's when the Allies declare war on Germany. And then Hitler goes on to invade France and Belgium and Russia. And he uses this wartime tactic called blitzkrieg, where it's like a fast lightning war, it's called. So the idea is to attack your enemy before they have time to prepare. And if you watch football, the word blitz comes from this word. Here's another map kind of zoomed out showing the territories that were invaded. And you can kind of see better here which neighboring countries were close by. And the next part is just who's on what side. So we're in the middle of page 3 now in your notes. So just jot these down. Things to note is that the Soviet Union starts on this side. They flip over here. The reason is early on, the Soviet Union and Germany, they signed this thing called a non-aggression pact. Like, we're not allies, but we're not going to attack each other, is what this agreement said. And then when the Nazis attack the Soviet Union, they flip over to the Allies. The U.S. is over here under later because we try to stay out of it as long as possible. The reason I highlighted the top ones these are kind of the main players. These other countries are involved and they're very important too. But the top ones in the highlighted blue and the red are the kind of the major players. So next is the U.S. Neutrality Acts. So you can see every year or two, there's like a new law that's passed. This is basically an action by Congress to try to stay out of it, to try to stay neutral, not involved. And this cartoon is really interesting to me. It shows Uncle Sam as like the metaphor of the United States kind of literally turning his back on Europe while it's burning and exploding. Here's another cartoon showing another Uncle Sam character here sitting in his tree while every other country is being taken over and toppled by this Nazi bird. And we're just kind of turning our back on what's going on. Next, we try to stay as neutral as possible, but we're like, our allies are running out of money, they're running out of soldiers, it's getting pretty bad. So basically, we're forced to help out in some way. And this is our solution to try to help without actually getting involved in like the physical part of the war. So check out this video. It's a quick 3-minute video that explains it really well. Basically, the idea is just like the text says here, we are not going to fight and we don't want to get involved, but what we'll do is we will lend or borrow wartime materials to our allies. So this is everything from like food to weapons to transportation to infrastructure, like anything. So these are like kind of the totals of the Lend-Lease Act. And basically it was a law that kind of tried to like keep us neutral. And it basically said we could sell things, we could lend them, or we could like borrow them. We could loan them. So this is like kind of the financial totals of all the things we sold, we lent, or we leased. At the time, the end of the video kind of talks about this movement. A lot of people disagreed with this Lend-Lease Act, and they said, hey, that's not being neutral. Like, helping one side is not neutral. And they wanted to stay totally isolated or separate. So isolationism is a policy of remaining apart, remaining separate. So there's these organizations that started like America First. And one of their slogans was just keep the U.S. out of war. There's another organization here. There's the America First also had this campaign called Save Our Sons, trying to like connect, like getting involved in the war is going to lead to these things like death. And then this is another really cool cartoon about kind of similar to the tree one about Uncle Sam sleeping in his bed while Europe is, sick and dying over here. The America First Committee enlisted celebrities like this guy, Charles Lindbergh, to kind of be their spokesperson. And these maps, this is not in your notes, but I wanted to show this to you. These are like two different maps, so the colors changed, but I really want you to focus on these green areas where the Axis has control. So it's really, for the most part, just like Germany and Italy and a tiny part of northern Africa here. And this is at the very start of the war in 1939. And these are just really the Axis powers in Europe. Germany and Italy, they're on the same team. These are the areas they control. And in a matter of 2 years, here's what happens. They invade so much that they take over nearly all of Europe. So you can see in the red are the Allied powers, the Soviet Union over here, and Great Britain over here. Iceland is technically like an Allied power, but they're kind of too far off to really matter much. And then if you might infer, these white countries like Turkey, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, they are neutral countries. Switzerland here, right in the middle of it all, they're all neutral, so they're not staying involved. Or I'm sorry, they're not getting involved. They're staying completely out of it. And then Hitler, as you can see, takes over all these countries. France, I mean, it's just invading and rolling in. So this is a really iconic picture of Hitler kind of posing for the cameras after he invaded Paris, France on a morning. Another thing we're looking into is, we're on to page 4, is propaganda. So I don't have any specific things I want you to write down here, but I just want to show you a bunch of examples. I think these are really interesting, and they kind of they tell a lot about what our country was going through at the time. So this, like, arguably the most iconic poster and propaganda in our country's history started in this era, this Uncle Sam figure, trying to encourage people to recruit and enlist in the army, the military. Here's other examples. You can note, like, kind of very patriotic stars and stripes symbolism here. We have other examples of like trying to encourage like workers. Like this is a worker up here who's like, from what we can see, like making this big bomb or this big cartridge, to handing it off to this soldier down here who's fighting in the Navy. So this idea to like try to encourage citizens to work hard in their role. Here's another example of Uncle Sam trying to like kind of keep people quiet from sharing secrets. They give you specific examples here, like don't discuss troop movements, where ships are moving, or even war equipment, any kind of secret. These are other examples about encouraging regular citizens to grow and preserve their own food. Like, hey, you can be a patriot if you do this. Like, you may not be able to fight in the war, but you can participate in these ways. Even getting kids involved. And this Uncle Sam figure, you can see, is really, really central in a lot of these figures. This is a longer video, so you can just watch the first minute or two. But basically, it's the thing to point out here is this is a government produced video. Oops. So let's try to play it here. So the thing I pointed out in class is the government produced this video for the consumption for American citizens to see. And this is all from the Office of War Information. So it's kind of a fancy way to say, like, there's literally a government office that's in charge of all these posters and movies. And they talk a little bit about how we can ration our food and reduce our consumption, and how we can work hard to produce more food to send to soldiers. So they have examples here, like with butter.
Cheese and eggs have been rationed, and the supply of butter is limited to 2 ounces a week.
So 2 ounces a week, if my memory is right, I think a stick of butter is a cup or 8 ounces. So basically, it's a quarter of a stick of butter per week.
But the English have learned to substitute vitamin preparation.
They're kind of glorifying like all these advances in technology to grow more food. There's other things like saving fats, like cooking fats, because they were used in the creation of these explosives and dynamite. So they're encouraging citizens, hey, after you cook your bacon, save the fat, take it to your butcher, and then your butcher will hand it over to the government. So this is an example of the government really like controlling the economy, and telling private business owners like what to do. Like, hey, you the butcher, the local butcher, you're gonna collect these for us. Here's a few other ones like the procedure for how to do it: strain it, keep it in a cool place, bring it to your butcher. Other ones are about buying these war bonds, so you can help finance the war, and they use a lot of different strategies. Like, the more money you give, the quicker the soldiers will come home, or you can be fighting too. Another one is, like you're participating in purchasing, these airplanes that our pilots are flying. There's other imagery here, like back here are these like kind of workers, and they're like kind of supporting the efforts of this soldier by working hard and buying war bonds. If you ever study Soviet art, this is very Soviet-like, which is very interesting. Another thing is like preserving natural resources like metal and rubber, which were in limited quantities. So they have this image here, like, if you're finding these things at your home, pipes and metal and square scrap metal, you can turn it in and get in touch with your local salvage committee to turn in your metal or even your rubber. I mean, at the time, rubber was like a very, very scarce resource. All right, back to your notes. Here's how World War II ended, kind of the lead up to the end. So, more commonly known as D-Day, um, there was an invasion of Nazi-occupied France by the Allied powers, so Canada, Australia, and the United States. And within a month, we got 1 million troops on land there. And it really was a turning point in the war. Germany was surrounded by the Soviet Union on the east and the Allies on the west, and eventually they surrendered. This is a very quick, very, 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 very quick summary. And in 1945, the Germans surrender. This is a quick map of the amphibious, like this kind of boat attack of these 5 different areas of France, which at the time this symbol shows was occupied by the Nazis. And these are some real photos of the invasion of soldiers. They arrived on these troop carriers that had this like kind of ramp that would drop, and then they would run onto the beach and charge these defensive posts that the Nazis had. And if you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, this is the opening scene. Really brutal, really hard. Here's some more photos that have been like color enhanced. And then I thought this was a really fascinating picture. After the dust had settled in the afternoon of D-Day, this is what the scene looked like. There was huge cargo ships coming up ashore with tanks and jeeps and vehicles and more troops. And basically it was kind of the start of like marching the Nazis back to this like kind of green area. So you can see these arrows kind of show this is the late part of the war, how they're pushing the Germans back and back and back over time. And you can contrast this with the first. This is what I wanted to show you. You can kind of contrast. This is what it looked like in the beginning of the war, and then by the end, the Germans were